We don't publish Instagram poets pretending to be authors. The words sliced through the elegant silence of Hamilton's private library, each syllable dripping with practiced disdain. Marcus clutched his manuscript tighter, its pages crinkling under trembling fingers. 6 years of early mornings, late nights, and relentless revisions reduced to a social media joke. Around him, crystal glasses clinked as Manhattan's literary elite exchanged knowing smirks, their amusement barely concealed behind vintage champagne. He'd scraped together 3 months' rent just to be here, to have his story heard. Now, under the warm glow of century-old chandeliers, that dream was crumbling into dust. The annual Hamilton Library Gala had always been more than just a literary event. It was a coronation ceremony for the publishing world's chosen ones. Tonight, the historic reading room breathed old money and influence, its oak-paneled walls lined with first editions worth more than Marcus's entire apartment. At the center of it all stood Lawrence Pierce, publishing magnate and self-proclaimed guardian of literary standards, his custom Armani suit a stark contrast to Marcus's department store blazer. The gathered crowd of best-selling authors and industry titans formed a perfect circle around them, an audience to what was quickly becoming Marcus's public execution. In the shadow of a towering bookshelf, a figure in a well-worn leather jacket shifted slightly, lowering his glass of untouched scotch. Christopher Nolan had built his career on stories about time, perception, and the power of ideas. Now, as he watched the young writer's dreams being systematically dismantled, something flickered in his eyes, the same look that had preceded some of cinema's most memorable moments of justice. The night was about to take an unexpected turn, and Lawrence Pierce's carefully curated literary hierarchy was about to face its own plot twist. The manuscript's pages whispered against each other as Marcus lowered his hands, each paper holding fragments of countless sleepless nights. His novel wasn't just words on pages, it was a labyrinth of interconnected stories, each character crafted with the same meticulous care Nolan brought to his films. But in this moment, under the judging eyes of New York's literary aristocracy, those carefully woven narratives felt like children's scribbles. Lawrence Pierce wasn't finished. He circled Marcus like a well-dressed vulture, each step measured on the Persian carpet that had probably witnessed a century of similar literary executions. "You see," he continued, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of aged bourbon, "this isn't some Twitter thread or TikTok story time. Hamilton's has been curating literary excellence since before your grandparents were born. We don't just publish books, we shape cultural heritage." Around them, the crowd shifted like a Greek chorus, their reactions carefully choreographed. Some nodded in solemn agreement, others hid their discomfort behind crystal glasses. A Pulitzer winner near the window studied her reflection instead of the scene, while a famous poet pretended to be deeply fascinated by the leather-bound first editions on display. The air grew thicker with each passing moment, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and unchallenged traditions. Near the grand fireplace, a young debut author who'd made it through these gates on Family Connections pressed her lips together, recognition flickering in her eyes. She'd been Marcus once, but her last name had bought her a different ending. Marcus drew a shallow breath, tasting old leather and expensive cologne in the air. "My story isn't about followers or trends," he started, his voice steadier than his hands. "It's about—" But Pierce's dismissive wave sliced through his words like a practiced executioner's blade. "Let me guess," Pierce interjected, adjusting his gold cufflinks with theatrical precision. "Another groundbreaking narrative about the human condition? Something revolutionary about society's darkness?" Each word dripped with the kind of practiced condescension that only generations of privilege could perfect. The chandelier light caught his signet ring as he gestured, casting dancing shadows across the wooden panels behind him. The crowd's laughter rolled through the room like thunder, but it wasn't unanimous. In the spaces between the cruel amusement, other reactions flickered: discomfort, recognition, shame. A renowned thriller writer near the window shifted uneasily, perhaps remembering his own humble beginnings at paperback publishing houses. An elderly editor's fingers tightened around her glass, her eyes carrying the weight of countless rejected masterpieces. Christopher Nolan set his untouched scotch on a nearby shelf, the small movement drawing a few curious glances. His presence at these events was rare enough to be remarkable, and his attention to this scene even more so. He'd seen this story before in Hollywood meetings, in studio offices, in every place where art collided with commerce and authenticity battled pretense. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes never left the manuscript in Marcus's hands. Pierce reached for Marcus's manuscript with manicured fingers, a snake preparing to strike. "Perhaps we should give our aspiring Hemingway a chance to prove me wrong," he announced, his voice carrying the false generosity of a man who'd already written the ending to this story. "Though I warn you, my time is considerably more valuable than whatever chain bookstore employee told you this was worth reading." The room's atmosphere shifted, anticipation mixing with the aged whiskey fumes and lemon-scented furniture polish. Marcus pulled the manuscript back instinctively, 6 years of his life refusing to become another prop in Pierce's performance. The motion sent several pages fluttering to the floor, landing like fallen leaves on the intricately patterned carpet. "Careful now," Pierce smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "That's hardly the way to treat your masterpiece, is it?" The word twisted in his mouth like something rotten. Behind him, a wall of leather-bound classics seemed to watch in judgment, their gold-leafed titles gleaming under the chandelier's light. Christopher Nolan's footsteps were barely audible on the thick carpet as he moved away from his shadowed corner. The subtle shift in his position drew eyes like a camera pulling focus, not just because of who he was, but because of how he moved, deliberate, measured, like a man who'd seen the entire story unfold before anyone else in the room. He'd built his career on making audiences question reality, on turning expectations inside out. Now, as he watched this literary ambush unfold, something in his expression suggested the evening's carefully scripted humiliation was about to face its own inception of doubt. Pierce bent down with exaggerated courtesy to retrieve the fallen pages, his movements carrying the predatory grace of someone who'd made an art form of public humiliation. As he straightened, his eyes scanned the first paragraph, and his practiced smirk widened into something crueler. Well, well. The fabric of reality stretched thin where memory met dream. Really? Did you borrow that from a fortune cookie? Or is this what passes for profound in creative writing workshops these days? The laughter that followed was immediate but fractured. Some joined eagerly, the sycophants, the social climbers, those who'd learned that mockery was the fastest path to Pierce's favor. Others laughed too late, too loud, their discomfort masked by overcompensation. A few didn't laugh at all, their silence forming small pockets of resistance in the carefully orchestrated spectacle. Christopher Nolan's attention had shifted from the manuscript to Pierce's performance, his gaze carrying the same intensity he brought to analyzing dailies on set. He'd seen this scene play out countless times in Hollywood, the gatekeepers who confused cruelty with curation, who'd rather destroy dreams than risk their own comfortable certainties. His hand moved to the inner pocket of his leather jacket, where he kept the dog-eared notebook that had eventually become Memento, a script rejected by every major studio before changing the landscape of modern cinema. Marcus stood frozen, watching his words become weapons in Pierce's hands. Each sentence read aloud, dripped with artificial sophistication, transformed into parody by Pierce's theatrical delivery. The publisher had moved on to a scene about time dilation during a near-death experience. The same phenomenon Nolan had explored in Inception, though Pierce seemed oblivious to the parallel as he reduced it to mockery. "This is the problem with amateurs," Pierce announced to his audience, warming to his role as literary executioner. "They mistake complexity for depth, confusion for profundity. Real literature doesn't need these cinematic tricks." The last words carried a subtle barb, a glancing acknowledgment of Nolan's presence that managed to be both dismissive and challenging at once. Cinematic tricks. Christopher Nolan's voice cut through the room like a sudden silence in a thunderstorm. He hadn't raised his volume, but his words carried the quiet authority that had commanded $100 million sets. The crowd's attention shifted instantly, social gravity realigning around this unexpected celestial body. Even Pierce's practiced smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Interesting choice of criticism," Nolan continued, moving forward with the deliberate pace of someone who understood the power of timing. The leather of his jacket creaked softly as he reached for Marcus's manuscript, still dangling like a trophy in Pierce's manicured grip. "Especially since Joyce employed montage techniques before cinema existed. Faulkner's narrative structures would put most screenwriters to shame. And Woolf's stream of consciousness?" A slight smile. "Pure editing room innovation, just decades ahead of the technology." Pierce's fingers tightened on the pages, creating small creases in Marcus's carefully formatted text. The publisher's composure remained intact, but something flickered behind his eyes, the first tremor of uncertainty in his carefully constructed world. "Mr. Nolan," he recovered smoothly, "while we all appreciate your contributions to popular entertainment, this is a matter of literary merit." Literary merit. Nolan weighed the words like he was testing their density, the same way he'd once contemplated the physics of dreams within dreams. "Tell me, Mr. Pierce, have you actually read the piece you're so eagerly dismantling? Because that passage you just mocked about time dilation during near-death experiences?" He gestured to the crumpled pages. "It demonstrates a more nuanced understanding of temporal perception than most physics textbooks manage." The room had grown so quiet that the soft settling of century-old wooden bookshelves became audible. The gathered literary elite found themselves in unfamiliar territory, their usual social choreography disrupted by this unexpected variable. Marcus stood straighter, hope warring with disbelief as one of modern cinema's most innovative storytellers defended not just his right to tell stories, but the actual substance of his work. Pierce adjusted his Italian silk tie, a gesture that usually preceded his most devastating literary executions. "Perhaps," he said, each syllable dripping with cultivated condescension, "you're unfamiliar with our standards here. Hamilton's has published 15 Nobel laureates, 23 Pulitzer winners. We don't gamble our reputation on amateur philosophizing about time and consciousness, no matter how cinematically appealing it might be." Standards. Nolan's response carried the same quiet intensity that had made studio executives rethink their definitions of impossible. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a weathered notebook, its pages yellow with age and dense with scribbled annotations. This was rejected by every major studio in Hollywood. Too complex, too challenging, not commercial enough. His eyes met Pierce's with uncomfortable directness. It became memento, changed how we think about narrative structure, but by your standards, it should never have existed. The crowd's attention ping-ponged between the two men like a perfectly edited tennis match. Several phones had appeared, recording discreetly. Tomorrow's social media would feast on this collision of cinema and literature. A famous mystery writer who'd previously been smirking at Marcus's humiliation now studied Nolan's worn notebook with undisguised fascination. Marcus watched his manuscript trembling in Pierce's grip, years of work literally caught between Hollywood innovation and literary tradition. The pages contained everything he was, every late night wrestling with dialogue, every morning questioning his choices, every moment wondering if he was wasting his life chasing an impossible dream. But now those same pages had somehow become the backdrop for a larger battle, a confrontation about the nature of storytelling itself. "The world doesn't need another experimental narrative," Pierce declared, but his voice had lost its theatrical certainty. "Readers want—" "Readers," Nolan interrupted, his tone carrying the weight of billions in box office receipts that proved audiences weren't afraid of complexity, "want stories that make them think, that challenge their perceptions, that dare to be different." He held out his hand for the manuscript. "Now, shall we see what this young man has actually written?" The silence that followed Nolan's challenge carried the weight of a final cut, that perfect moment between scenes where everything hangs in balance. Pierce's fingers whitened around the manuscript, creating new creases in Marcus's carefully formatted pages. The publisher's carefully curated mask of superiority cracked slightly, revealing something darker beneath: fear. Not of Nolan specifically, but of what he represented: the democratization of storytelling, the blurring of lines between mediums, the threat to traditional gatekeepers. "This isn't about cinema versus literature," Pierce attempted, his voice straining to maintain its aristocratic polish. "This is about maintaining standards in an age where anyone with a laptop thinks they're the next great American novelist, where social media followers translate to book deals, where—" "Where people like you," Nolan cut in, his quiet intensity filling the room more effectively than Pierce's projected authority ever had, "still believe they own the rights to storytelling itself." He stepped closer, close enough to see the individual threads in Pierce's $1,000 tie. "Do you know what I look for in a story, Mr. Pierce? Not the author's pedigree, not their MFA, not their social connections." His eyes flickered to the manuscript. "I look for the thing that terrifies people like you the most: originality." The gathered crowd had grown so still that the soft settling of leather-bound books on ancient shelves echoed like thunderclaps. Several of Pierce's usual sycophants had begun edging away, social instincts warning them that the evening's power dynamics were shifting tectonically. A renowned literary critic who had been preparing to write a scathing editorial about declining standards found herself instead opening a notes app, recording Nolan's words verbatim. Marcus watched this clash of titans with a strange mix of awe and vertigo. His story, his dreams, his fears, his 6 years of Dawn Patrol writing sessions had somehow become the catalyst for a larger battle. A battle not just about his manuscript, but about the future of storytelling itself. Originality, Pierce spat the word like it was personally offensive, but his usual commanding presence had diminished, shrinking under Nolan's unwavering gaze. "We've seen 1,000 manuscripts like this: time manipulation, reality distortion, consciousness exploration. Every writing workshop graduate thinks they're reinventing the wheel." He brandished the crumpled pages like evidence in a trial. "What makes this one so special?" "What made Inception special?" Nolan countered, his voice carrying the same measured certainty that had convinced studios to invest hundreds of millions in his impossible dreams. Time manipulation, reality distortion, consciousness exploration, all concepts that existed before. But it's not about the ingredients, Mr. Pierce. It's about the story someone dares to tell with them. Without warning, Nolan plucked a random page from Pierce's grasp, smoothed it with careful hands that had once handled priceless IMAX cameras. "Time didn't move in straight lines anymore," he read, his voice giving Marcus's words the gravity they deserved. It folded back on itself like origami, each crease holding memories that belonged to futures that hadn't happened yet. The words hung in the air, transformed by Nolan's delivery from mere text to something almost cinematic. Several of the literary guests who had been smirking earlier now leaned forward, their expressions shifting from condescension to reluctant interest. A prominent book reviewer frantically tapped notes into her phone, already mentally restructuring her next column. "That's not just clever wordplay," Nolan continued, his intensity building like a perfectly paced third act. "That's someone understanding how human consciousness actually processes temporal experience. The same principles I explored in Interstellar, but approached from an entirely fresh perspective." He turned to Marcus, who stood straighter under the director's analytical gaze. "How long did it take you to develop this temporal metaphor structure?" Before Marcus could answer, Pierce interjected, but his voice had lost its theatrical authority, revealing the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed kingdom begin to crumble. "This isn't some Hollywood pitch meeting. This is Hamilton's. We have traditions, standards." "Standards," Nolan repeated, the word carrying the weight of every revolutionary idea that had ever been dismissed by someone protecting the status quo. "Let me tell you about standards, Mr. Pierce. When I pitched Memento, every studio executive had standards too. Audiences won't understand it. The timeline is too complex. It breaks too many rules." He gestured toward the walls of leather-bound classics surrounding them. "How many of your beloved authors broke the rules of their time? Joyce, Woolf, Faulkner? How many of them were told their work was too experimental, too challenging, too different?" The manuscript in Pierce's hands trembled slightly, decades of publishing authority crumbling against the quiet force of Nolan's logic. Around them the crowd had shifted, physically and metaphorically. Those who had been eagerly anticipating Marcus's humiliation now looked uncomfortable, as if suddenly aware they were on the wrong side of history. A young editorial assistant was openly filming on her phone, tomorrow's social media already lighting up with the hashtag #Hamilton's Gate. "The truth is," Nolan continued, his voice carrying the same compelling intensity that had made audiences believe in dream architects and time-dilating black holes, "you're not protecting standards, Mr. Pierce. You're protecting comfort, your comfort, the comfort of knowing exactly what stories deserve to be told and who deserves to tell them." Marcus stood straighter, watching his manuscript, his years of dawn writing sessions, his countless revisions, his dreams of contributing something meaningful to the world of storytelling become a symbol in a battle larger than himself. Pierce's grip on the pages had loosened, his knuckles no longer white with righteous indignation, but pale with the realization that he was facing not just a challenge to his authority, but to the very foundation of his worldview. "So," Nolan concluded, extending his hand once more for the manuscript, "shall we judge this story by your comfortable standards, or shall we do what literature has always done at its best, dare to imagine something new?" The manuscript passed from Pierce's hands to Nolan's with the gravity of a torch being passed between generations. The gathered literary elite watched in stunned silence as decades of unquestioned authority dissolved in a single gesture. Pierce's carefully curated mask of superiority had cracked completely, revealing the uncertainty beneath. The same uncertainty that had rejected Joyce, dismissed Faulkner, and sneered at Woolf's early experiments with consciousness. The room's atmosphere transformed, social currents shifting like tides responding to a new moon. Those who had been eagerly anticipating Marcus's humiliation now studied him with different eyes, reassessing not just his work, but their own roles in this ancient gatekeeping dance. The young editorial assistant's phone continued recording, her hands steady now, understanding she was documenting a moment that would be referenced in tomorrow's think pieces and next semester's publishing courses. Nolan handled the manuscript with the same care he'd give to a precious film reel, smoothing the wrinkles Pierce's grip had left in the pages. His eyes moved across the text with genuine interest, not the performative judgment that had characterized Pierce's reading. "You understand," he said to Marcus, his voice carrying that rare combination of authority and authenticity that had defined his career. That breaking new ground means taking fire from the old guard. Are you ready for that? Marcus looked at his manuscript in Nolan's hands, not just pages anymore, but a symbol of something larger than himself. "I spent 6 years writing this," he said, his voice finding new strength. 6 years questioning every word, every scene, every idea, not because I wanted to break rules, but because this was the only way to tell this story truthfully. The crowd's attention had shifted from the spectacle of Pierce's defeat to the genuine passion in Marcus's voice. A well-known literary critic who'd arrived ready to write another piece about declining standards was now scribbling notes about gatekeeping and innovation. Near the fireplace, the debut author who'd gained entry through family connections closed her eyes briefly, perhaps reconsidering her own path to publication. Pierce had retreated to the edges of the gathering, his usual court of sycophants notably absent. The publisher's carefully constructed world of absolute authority had crumbled, leaving him to face questions he'd spent a career avoiding. His phone buzzed incessantly, no doubt his PR team already tracking the viral spread of hashtag Hamilton'sGate and hashtag NolanDefends across social media. "Sometimes," Nolan observed, turning another page with genuine interest, "the most revolutionary acts in art aren't about breaking rules for the sake of breaking them. They're about finding new ways to tell universal truths." He looked up at Marcus. "Your time dilation sequences, they're not just technical exercises. They're about how grief changes our perception of reality, aren't they?" Marcus nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "My sister," the way time seemed to stop, then rush, then loop back on itself after she... He didn't need to finish. Nolan's expression showed he understood, not just as a filmmaker who'd explored similar themes, but as someone who recognized the raw truth beneath the technical complexity. The Hamilton Library's reading room had transformed. What began as a stage for public humiliation had become something else, a moment of genuine connection between artists across mediums, generations, and expectations. The gathered literary establishment watched in silence as Nolan closed the manuscript with the careful reverence of someone who knew exactly how much dreams weighed. "Mr. Pierce," Nolan called, his voice carrying to where the publisher stood in his new exile, "you were right about one thing: standards do matter." He placed his hand on the manuscript. "This meets them, not because it follows your rules, but because it dares to tell the truth in a way no one else has." The young editorial assistant finally lowered her phone, but the moment had already been captured, shared, and would soon become part of publishing industry legend. Tomorrow discussions would rage about gatekeeping, about innovation, about who gets to decide what stories matter. But for now, in the warm light of century-old chandeliers, surrounded by the ghosts of literary revolutionaries past, a new voice had been recognized not for its pedigree, but for its power. And somewhere, on those shelves of leather-bound classics, space awaited for stories yet to be told.